Jeep's Wrangler has always intrigued me. The Wrangler is arguably the most capable off-road vehicle you can buy from the factory in America today. But the Wrangler doesn't just sell to people that like off-road vehicles. Otherwise, they wouldn't be selling nearly 250,000 Wranglers every year. A lot of folks don't realize this, but one of the most frequently cross-shot vehicles against the Wrangler is not necessarily a pickup truck or another off-road vehicle or even necessarily another Jeep, but something along the lines of a Ford Mustang convertible. Admittedly, a lot of Wrangler shoppers would never dream of cross-shopping a sporty two-door convertible against an off-road beast like this, but there is some logic to the madness here. Both of them tend to be very lifestyle-oriented vehicles. People will buy the Wrangler because they like the look, not necessarily because they plan on taking it off-road. And FCA and Jeep really know this, and that's why we have the four-door Wrangler that we're driving right here, and that's also why we have the Sahara edition, which is what we're driving today. Arguably, the Sahara is the more on-road focused version of the Wrangler. It's available only in this four-door format. We get more road-oriented tires, and unusually for a Wrangler, we get a full-time all-wheel drive system, or four-wheel drive system, whatever you want to call it, rather than a part-time system that we find in most of the other Wranglers. Up front, this still looks just like a classic Jeep. Jeep has done an excellent job at keeping this generation of the Wrangler still looking like a Wrangler. The front bumper is very separate from the body. It's easily removable, easily replaceable. A lot of things about the Wrangler were definitely designed with customization in mind, whether those are parts from Jeep themselves or parts that you'll buy aftermarket. If you're wondering, there is a metal bumper underneath this plastic wrap, so don't worry about that, and that's how it supports these large tow hooks right up front. Jeep offers essentially all of the latest active safety features available on the Wrangler, but very few of them are standard. One thing that's worth noting, however, is that they position the radar sensor right here behind the windshield, and that is a really nice place to put it in a vehicle like the Wrangler. The system will still function whether the windshield is up or down. There's a little cover that will go over it if the windshield is in the down position or has been removed from the vehicle. And that means that if you put tow bars or different bumpers or winches or whatever you want to put in on the front of the Wrangler, it's not going to interfere with the radar adaptive cruise control system because that sensor is nice and high. That's one of the reasons that they put it up there. Because of the Wrangler's mission as an off-road vehicle, Jeep has kept the dimensions pretty in check in this generation. The two-door version comes in at 166.8 inches long, just about the same length overall as a Kia Soul. That means that depending on how you want to look at it, that two-door Wrangler fits very solidly in the subcompact segment in America, down there with the Jeep Renegade, which is just about the same size overall as the two-door Wrangler. But the Wrangler is an awful lot wider than just about anything else in that segment, again, because of its off-road mission. Today we're taking a look at the four-door version, which stretches things out to 188.4 inches long, solidly in the mid-size crossover segment. This is almost exactly the same length as a Ford Edge, but again, notably wider than some of those other mid-size crossovers we see in America because of the off-road mission. And if you get the very top-end Rubicon version, then we get a track that's even wider. It was critical to Jeep that even though this generation of the Wrangler was a complete clean sheet redesign versus the last model, that it still looked instantly recognizable as a Wrangler, and that continues up back. We have the tire mounted there on the rear door. The door still opens in a half-step fashion right like that because we do have the soft top up here. We just pull this out, pull these side wedges there, and then we can unzip the plastic top right like that. There are a number of different tops that we'll go over a bit later, and then we have LED turn signals and brake lights on either side. Now, as I said, there are a number of different tops available for the Wrangler. This soft top is pretty easy to use, but it is a little bit awkward just because of the overall size of the components involved here. So I find it easier to go inside to pull it up, and then of course you have to come over here, pull it back down, then go on the inside, latch it back into place, and then you have to zip all the side pieces back into place. That's going to take a little bit of time if you're trying to drive topless and then it starts to rain. The hard top is of course trickier still because it has to be bolted onto the vehicle, and it's going to take at least two people to pull it on and off the Wrangler every time you want to remove it. Personally, I think that the optional roller top is the way to go. It's based on the hard top, and then it has a canvas section right there in the middle. Some people call that a California roof, whatever you want to call it. It has a section that sort of rolls back to about here and gives you a very, very large openable sunroof. Although that roof is an expensive $4,000 option, I think that's the one that I would get on my four-door Wrangler. It's not available on the two-door model, but you can get it on this particular one because you can open and close it while you're moving. From the factory, all Wranglers, whether we're talking about two-door models or four-door models, are convertibles. That is important to remember. That's part of why the Wrangler ends up being so much more expensive than some of the other options out there. It costs an awful lot, and it is much more difficult to make a vehicle like this that can pass minimum crash tests with features like removable doors, a convertible top, optional hard tops, etc., and a front windshield that will collapse all the way forward if you want it to. Jeep gives us a kit, a little tool kit right here with a little tiny ratchet and all the appropriate tools to remove the doors. The hinges are external, and that's part of why, so that way they can be removed. And there are also some little doodads, that way you can take off the side view mirrors and then mount them right there on the front door hinge, so you still are in compliance even when the doors are off. We'll talk about this a little bit later in the video, but personally, I find the fuel economy in the Wrangler pretty impressive, and a lot of that has to do with the new 2-liter turbocharged engine. This does use a mild hybrid system. Jeep is calling it e-torque, but keep in mind it is a very, very mild system. The electric motor is never going to be able to run the Jeep on its own. It's a pretty small electric motor. It's basically just there to facilitate start-stop and help that start-stop feel a little bit more natural than some other systems out there. It's going to give you a little bit of extra torque from that initial launch while the turbo is still spooling up because the engine has just been restarted. It's going to help smooth out gear shifts, but it's not really going to give you much more than that. And it's never going to run the Jeep Wrangler electric only. When developing this generation of the Wrangler, fuel economy was incredibly important. That's due to government regulations in the United States. Because of the overall compact dimensions that we see in the Wrangler, fuel economy requirements end up being pretty high. If you want to know more about how the corporate average fuel economy standards in America affect vehicle design, we'll have a separate video on that later. But let's get back to the Wrangler. Things start out with the ubiquitous 3.6-liter V6 engine. We see that in a wide variety of FCA vehicles, from Jeeps to Dodges to Chryslers, etc. Under this hood, it produces 285 horsepower and 260 pound-feet of torque. It's mated to either your choice of a 6-speed manual, so if you want a manual transmission in your Jeep, you can still get one, or an 8-speed automatic transmission, and the 8-speed is honestly my preference for the Wrangler. Then we have this engine right here. It's a 2-liter 4-cylinder turbocharged engine. It's an entirely new engine design for FCA, based loosely on the 2-liter 4-cylinder turbo we find in some of the Alfa Romeos out there. This produces 270 horsepower, so a little bit less power than the 3.6, but a whopping 295 pound-feet of torque, so notably more than the V6, and the torque comes on at much lower RPMs, so this definitely feels more torquey than the V6 engine. If you want even more torque in your Wrangler, then 2020 is going to bring us a new 3-liter turbo diesel engine under this hood, producing 260 horsepower and an expected 442 pound-feet of torque. That's going to be basically the same engine that we see in the Ram 1500 EcoDiesel. There are a few different 4-wheel drive systems depending on the trim that you get. The Sport trim gets a 2.72-to-1 low ratio mode and a part-time 4-wheel drive system. So you have to engage it into 4 high or 4 low, and then you're supposed to use those 4-wheel drive modes on loose pavement only. The Sahara model, which is what we're driving right here, borrows the transfer case out of a Grand Cherokee or Durango models, depending on the exact year there. This has a very similar low ratio mode of 2.72-to-1, but it offers a full-time all-wheel drive mode, so you can put it into 4 high auto, and it will automatically apportion power front to rear just like a Grand Cherokee or the Dodge Durango. Then if we step up into the Rubicon model, we go back to the part-time system, and we get a more aggressive 4-to-1 low ratio. Because of the rear-wheel drive body-on-frame design, you might be tempted to think that the Wrangler is designed to tow more than it really is. Towing ranges from 2,000 pounds to 3,500 pounds, depending on whether you get the 2-door or the 4-door model, and exactly which version of the Wrangler you get. The reason that towing ability is lower than something like the Jeep Cherokee or Jeep Grand Cherokee is because of the off-road mission of the Wrangler. The wheelbase is relatively short, the springs are relatively soft, and the overall vehicle design is definitely targeted more at off-roading than towing, and that's why those tow ratings end up being a little bit lower than you might suspect. When it comes to front seat comfort, it's a little bit difficult to compare the Wrangler really to much else out there because there are very few vehicles like this. But these seats are, generally speaking, going to be less comfortable than other Jeeps with similar price tags to the Wrangler. We have a manual seat design, so we have a manual height adjustment, manual lumbar support knob right there, and then this little bit of webbing right here is how we recline the seat. That's mainly due to the off-road and doors-off mission of the Wrangler. That's why we don't see power seats here. We do have a tilt telescopic steering column with a minor range of motion, but it is going to make it easier for shorter and taller drivers to find a good driving position. In my opinion, you'll definitely find more comfortable front seats in something like the Jeep Cherokee or the Jeep Grand Cherokee with similar price tags to this Wrangler, but you'll also find more comfortable seats in something like the Chevy Colorado if that's what you want to compare this to. I do find this seat, however, more comfortable than the Toyota Tacoma. This generation of the Wrangler really has a surprising amount of legroom. 77.8 inches combined if you get the two-door version, 79.5 if you get the four-door version like this. Even though the two-door Wrangler is about the same size as a Jeep Renegade, and this is a rear-wheel drive vehicle designed for inline engines to be definitely in front of the passenger compartment, we get 1 inch more combined legroom than we find in the Jeep Renegade. Headroom is also pretty generous back here. If I sit very upright in this rear seat, you'll notice that I have about 2 inches of headroom left. I do have the fabric top open at the moment. If you get the hard top, then overall headroom is pretty similar as well. We have this rollover bar right here in front of me that contains the speaker modules, and then of course the map lights for the rear passengers as well, but that doesn't really impact headroom back here at all. Even though the two-door Wrangler is as short as something like a Kia Soul, it is definitely wider inside, and that means that adults are going to be a little bit more comfortable than the average subcompact crossover right here in the middle seat. And if I move all the way over to the left side, sitting right there behind myself, you'll notice I still have about 3 or 4 inches left. That's going to give us a little bit more room for some child seats. Cargo capacity behind the rear seats comes in at 31.7 cubic feet, pretty similar to a Toyota RAV4. Again, this is a little bit trickier than some of those other crossovers out there to get into. We do have to pull off the rear window right like that. If you really want to get in back there, you can always flip it over there to the top. And then we have access to this large cargo area back here. No cargo space is consumed by the spare tire, but we do have the optional audio system, which does take up a little bit of room for that subwoofer back there. And you can see that the rear seats fold almost completely flat with the cargo area in the back, making this a pretty large and accommodating area. We also have cargo tie downs, 3 on each side, and if I open this lid, there's a little bit of extra storage area. This is where you could put some of those flexible side panels in that bag for storage. And if you're worried about losing the screws when you take off the windshield or the doors or the roof, there are places right back here where you can put those items, little slots for each of the pins for the door hinges, etc. And then under this tray is where we find the jack and the tire iron. From the driver's side, you can see what the soft top looks like. Again, we have that support bar right there across from the B-pillar to the other side, right there behind the driver and front passengers' heads. You can see that the soft top opens pretty much right there over the rear passengers' heads as well, so they get a pretty good view, and that's without collapsing it all the way to the back. The driver and front passenger get height adjustable shoulder belts, two-way adjustable headrests. This model has leather upholstery, and we have Sahara embroidered right there on the leather seat backs. These seats are heated, but they're not ventilated. Bolstering is fairly moderate on the rear seat back and seat bottom cushion, so larger folks won't have any problem with these seat designs. As we move on over to the front doors, you'll definitely notice more soft touch materials than we've seen in the Wrangler before. The entire upper section of the door is a soft touch material. We then have a soft touch armrest and then harder plastics down there towards the bottom. One thing you'll notice on the doors, as we've seen in other Wrangler models, is that we don't have very many switches over there. That's because they wanted to keep the wiring harness connection that you can see right down there at the bottom of the door as small as possible, so that way it's easier to plug and unplug the door when you remove it from the vehicle. Moving over to the center of the dashboard, we find essentially the same 8.4-inch infotainment system that we see in the Grand Cherokee and the Cherokee. Below that, we have controls for the dual-zone automatic climate control that this particular model has. This is also where you'll find the engine start-stop enable-disable button, stability control enable-disable button, parking sensor enable-disable, and hill descent control. There's also a button to turn off the infotainment screen if you don't want it to distract you. Below the climate controls, we find a 12-volt power port, media inputs right over here, USB-C, regular USB, and auxiliary input, and then the buttons for the windows. You don't find them on the doors again because they want to reduce the weight of the doors, that way it's easier to get in and out of the vehicle and reduce the complexity of some of those connectors in the doors as well. Continuing down from there, we have a very small storage cubby right there, and then a chunky shifter. You see we have a little Jeep right there on the top, which is a nice touch. Manual mode is over to the left. We push away from the driver for gear down, pull towards the driver for gear up. On this side, you'll see a very interesting feature for a Wrangler, and that's a shifter with the 4-high auto mode. This uses a clutch pack in the center coupling to transfer power to the front while still allowing some slip between the front and rear axles. So you can use this 4-high auto mode on regular pavement. This is the Wrangler with the set it and forget it 4-wheel drive system. You can put it in 2-high if you want to save fuel, 4-high if you want that auto mode, and then we can move it over to 4-high part-time that locks the coupling. That should only be used on softer pavement. We then have neutral and then 4-low, just as you'd expect out of a Wrangler as well. Over on the driver's side, we have a physical speedometer on the right, a physical tachometer on the left, and then a large LCD right there in the middle. You can see that part of it is inside this dial and is showing us the status of the 4-wheel drive system, either 4 auto or 2-high right there. And then in the center, we have a color multifunction display that gives us things like our trip computer readouts, audio system readout, screen setup options. We can change certain settings there, a digital speedometer, and then we get some additional gauge readouts, which is definitely handy if you're off-roading here. One interesting touch is that even in this turbocharged model, none of these readouts is a turbo boost gauge, and none of the off-road information will tell you what the automatic setting in the four-wheel drive system is doing. So it's not going to show you power split front to rear, it's just going to do it, and then it's going to show you the steering angle right there, inclination, that sort of thing in these off-road screens, but it's not going to give you that power flow. The steering wheel is a little different than we find in the Cherokee or Grand Cherokee because this is FCA's newest steering wheel design. You can see that the button modules are much more similar to what we see in the Ram 1500 than the Jeep Grand Cherokee, for instance. But the overall functionality is still very much the same. We find the controls for the radar adaptive cruise control over here on the right, the controls for that multifunction LCD over here on the left, along with voice command and phone buttons, and then we still have the infotainment controls on the back of the steering wheel. Volume up and down over here on the right, track forward and backward over there on the left. There are a lot of off-road vehicles available in America. You can get something like an off-road pickup truck, or there are a lot of German off-road vehicles that are available as well. Something like a G-Wagon is going to be just about as capable as this Wrangler, although it's going to be an awful lot more expensive. There are just tons and tons of different vehicles to choose from, but none of them are quite like this, where you could remove the windows, you could remove the doors, you could remove the lid if you wanted to. There are tons of different roof options as well. Again, I think that my personal preference is that optional $4,000 electric sliding one that can be opened and closed at 60 miles an hour, but hey, the soft top is not a bad option either. Now let's get to the performance numbers. The 2-liter turbocharged version of the Wrangler is the fastest 0 to 60. 6.5 seconds is what we recorded in this particular 4-door model. That is significantly faster than the last V6 model that we tested. Although in recent tests of other dealer-provided V6 models, we were getting about 7 seconds. So I'm not exactly clear what went wrong with the Rubicon that we last tested. That got 9 seconds, 0 to 60. Clearly something was wrong there. A dealer-provided 4-door V6 model went from 0 to 60 in 7 seconds even. That definitely sounds an awful lot more reasonable. About half-second difference between the turbo and the V6 in terms of overall acceleration. The 4-cylinder turbo definitely has a lot of low-end torque. That is one of the big benefits to the turbocharged design, and that really is going to be a big differentiator between this and the V6 in certain off-road situations. When you can get the boost on in this engine, you're climbing up steeper trails, you are going to notice the difference. When it comes to the braking score, this definitely takes a little bit longer than the average crossover because of the overall weight, the dimensions, center of gravity, etc., and the tire choice. It took 137 feet for this vehicle to stop from 60 miles an hour back to 0. That is definitely longer than some crossovers out there, but oddly enough, it is exactly the same distance that it took a Toyota RAV4 Adventure to stop from 60 to 0. So depending on how you want to look at it, in our 60 to 0 braking test, this definitely takes a little bit longer to stop than some of the crossovers available in America, but it may also surprise you. This particular model took 137 feet, which is identical to what it took a Toyota RAV4 Adventure, and obviously this is significantly more off-road capable than that RAV4. When it comes to handling, I'm going to give the Ranger a big question mark because I'm really not sure what you want to compare this to. Now, that said, this is not going to handle as well as basically any crossover available in America. Pick your crossover, from a Jeep Renegade to a Jeep Cherokee to a Grand Cherokee to a Mazda CX-3, a Ford Explorer, whatever you want to name, they're going to handle better than this Wrangler right here. It's really obvious when you get this out on your favorite winding mountain road that this is the kind of vehicle that you drive sedately on your way to the off-road park with the top open, enjoying the sea breeze or the mountain air or wherever it is that you are. But it's not really a canyon carver. Part of that has to do with the overall curb weight, part of that has to do with the tires, part of that has to do with the suspension design and the fact that we have a massive amount of ground clearance, of course. Now, on the other hand, if you wanted to compare this to a mid-size or a small pickup truck in America, then I think that overall handling is a little bit more similar there. This does feel a little bit more like the Chevy Colorado Bison, a little bit more like a Tacoma TRD Pro, but depending on the situation, they still might outhandle the Wrangler. I was initially really torn about putting this all-wheel drive trail in this video because the Wrangler is capable of so much more. This is a true rock crawling kind of vehicle. We have skid plates underneath, we have massive wheel articulation, you can get all the various bells and whistles in the very top end Rubicon model, lockers, front and rear, that sort of thing. And not only would this trail not challenge the Rubicon model, this trail isn't really a challenge for this Sahara version either. But the reality is that this is about as difficult a trail as most folks that buy a Wrangler will ever see. So it really seemed reasonable to put this trail to the test. The other reason I decided to go down this trail, and now it's time to turn around, is that we're driving the Sahara version of the Wrangler, and this has the full-time all-wheel drive system. Very different than what we see in the rest of the Wrangler lineup, and more similar to what we see in the Grand Cherokee. You notice that I just made a pretty tight turn there. We're still in that 4-high auto mode. We didn't get any binding. We didn't get any sort of weird wheel slip. That's because this vehicle has the ability to apportion power front and rear whenever it needs to, and the front axle and rear axle can spin at different rates, which allows you to leave this system on whether we're on a gravel trail or a rocky trail like we're on here, or whether just on regular asphalt. If you're looking for the right Wrangler to commute in, this is exactly the model that I would choose. I wouldn't get the Rubicon, I wouldn't get the Sport. This is the model that I would get simply because of that full-time all-wheel drive system. Before everybody flames me down there in the comment section for calling this an all-wheel drive mode, remember that the difference between all-wheel drive and four-wheel drive is entirely marketing. Manufacturers will call identical systems one or the other, depending on what product it's in. There really is no mechanical difference. What's more important is the way the systems behave. And if I were to move this over, for instance, to the 4 part-time option, I now have a complete lock between the front differential and the rear differential, and it's going to behave differently. As I go around tighter corners, you're going to feel that the driveline is going to bind a little bit. You're going to get a little bit more scrabble on the tires because the front and rear differentials are now locked together. They have to spin at exactly the same rate. When your front differential and rear differential are locked together, it has the effect of reducing your handling ability out on pavement, even if the pavement is wet. The only exception there would be if you're on pavement in ice or snow and you're stuck, then you want to engage the mode. But if you're not stuck and you're just driving your daily commute in those situations, you're probably best suited to leave it in 2-wheel drive unless you really need that extra traction. When it comes to the overall ride score, the Wrangler does fairly well, even though we have a short wheelbase overall. We do get a little bit more of a bobblehead feel in the short wheelbase Wrangler, the 2-door model, than we do in this 4-door model. The 4-door definitely is a little bit more family friendly. It rides a little bit more comfortably. So I'm going to give this overall an A- when it comes to the ride score, whether you're talking about comparing this to the average pickup truck in America or a crossover like Jeep's own Cherokee. The Wrangler does a decent job of soaking up larger imperfections out on the road, and if you were to take this out on a rougher gravel road, you definitely aren't going to be bouncing around the cabin in the same way that you would some of those more modern crossovers. In our cabin noise test at 50 miles an hour, we measured 74.5 decibels in here, making this one of the louder vehicles that we've tested recently. You can definitely blame that soft top for that louder interior score. There's a reasonable amount of tire noise, but not too much more than we find in most off-road trucks. And the glass overall controls road noise relatively well, but a lot of noise is coming in from that top. If you get the hardtop version of the Wrangler, then things are definitely a little bit quieter, but it's still not going to be as quiet as a vehicle that was designed with a single-piece body construction. What surprised me most about the Wrangler this week may surprise you, and that is the fuel economy. We've been averaging 24.1 miles per gallon over a week of mixed driving in this Wrangler, and even when my editor was driving this around town on her daily commute, she was averaging over 22 miles per gallon. Both of us were getting over the EPA score, even though she was doing a lot of stop and go and city driving, and I was doing mountain driving, climbing up and over a 2,200-foot mountain pass. That fuel economy score is pretty impressive when you consider that this vehicle is shaped like a brick, has relatively wide tires on it, 2 solid axles, a 2-speed transfer case, skid plates, all the off-road hardware that we've talked about so far here. This is a truly extraordinary fuel economy figure for something like the Wrangler. Previous generations of the Wrangler really hovered right around the upper to mid-teens. This is a significant improvement, bumping this up into the 20s. Now obviously your overall fuel economy score will vary based on the terrain that you're driving on. If you're doing a lot of in-city driving, you're obviously going to be getting lower fuel economy than I was getting right here. If I were shopping for a Wrangler, the 2-liter turbocharged engine is absolutely the engine that I would get. Not only do we get that improved low-end torque, we also get these impressive fuel economy figures. In real-world driving with the V6 engine in the Wrangler, I was getting at or slightly below EPA fuel economy numbers, but the turbo really bumped things up to a level that I hadn't really expected. And yes, before you ask, we always verify our fuel economy figures here. We fill, drive, refill, etc. to get our fuel economy figures, and the fuel economy numbers seem very, very accurate in the Wrangler. In general terms of modern cars, remember that the trip computer is going to be the most accurate way of determining your fuel economy. Doing the fill, drive, fill method, there's actually a little bit more variance going on there than just letting the computer calculate things out. But again, we always verify those numbers. Overall, out on the road, the Wrangler is exactly what you'd expect out of a modern Wrangler. It's fun, it's definitely targeted at off-road, not on-road ability. It's a little bit louder than you might be expecting out on the road, but fuel economy is quite impressive in this model, and it is unquestionably a lot of fun.
For 2018, the Wrangler was completely new, so we didn't really see too many changes for the 2019 model year, and we aren't really seeing too many for the upcoming 2020 model year either. However, we do already know what some of those tweaks will be for 2020. For instance, we know that the optional LED headlamps will be available on lower end trims. For instance, you'll be able to get them on the Sport S trim. That's a bit of a change from 2018 and 2019. We also know that the Sahara trims with the automatic transmission will get the FCA e-Torque mild hybrid system on the V6 as well. But the e-Torque path has been a little bit complicated for the Wrangler, and we're actually seeing the removal of the e-Torque mild hybrid system on some Wrangler models. We don't know exactly why, but I suspect it could just be parts and availability. The e-Torque models have been relatively popular for the Ram pickup trucks, and so they may have troubles getting all the battery systems together for all the vehicles they want to put it in. So they may be just picking and choosing which models it will be available in for 2020. For instance, in the Sport and Rubicon trims, you won't be able to get the e-Torque system. You'll only be able to get the regular 2.0T. But on the other hand, we will be able to get the new diesel engine in the Wrangler Unlimited models for the Sport, Sahara, and Rubicon trims. The prices you see on your screen are 2019 prices. For 2020, the base prices go up about $250 across the board. The main thing to know about the Wrangler lineup if you're shopping is if you want the two-door model, that would be the Sport S, or the Rubicon. The rest of the trims you see on your screen are four-door vehicles only. That's why you see those two different price tags there. That said, I think my personal favorite in this lineup would be, of course, the four-door Sahara model, as I said before. For 2020, the Wrangler is going to be one of the few manual transmissioned vehicles available in America. It's also going to be one of the only options that still has a crank window option. So if you're that kind of person and you really just want a manual transmission, crank windows, and a naturally aspirated V6, this is still the vehicle for you. This is also still one of the few vehicles in America that has a pretty expensive automatic transmission upgrade. If you want the automatic transmission for 2019, that's an extra $2,000. And if you want the 2-liter turbo, that's an extra $1,000 on top of that. Now for 2020, that will be changing a little bit. That's some of the pricing detail that has finally leaked out of Jeep. For 2020, it'll be a $1,500 upgrade over the manual transmission to get both the 2-liter turbo and the 8-speed automatic transmission, but you won't get the e-Torque mild hybrid system. Now, personally, I think that's an okay trade-off because that's half the price that upgrade cost you in 2019. So it's still a pretty decent deal, and it will actually make that model notably less expensive than the 2019 model, even though the base price has gone up across the line. But oddly enough, it looks like the price has increased for the V6 and 8-speed automatic transmission. We're not entirely clear why that is. I suspect it may have something to do with overall fuel economy standards and FCA's real need to start driving customers into more fuel-efficient versions of the Wrangler over time. If I were shopping for a Wrangler today, my preferred option would end up at around $55,000. That's for a pretty much fully loaded Sahara version with the Sky Power top. Although there are still some less expensive versions of the Wrangler available, you'll notice that most of the models you'll find on the dealer lot are going to be well over $35,000. It's pretty easy to get to that price point, even if you're taking a look at the base Sport trim, which theoretically started at $28,000 before destination. During my week with the Wrangler, I kept racking my brain trying to think of what else you could compare the Wrangler to, and really, the only thing I could come up with is a Toyota 4Runner. This is really as close as you're going to be able to get to the four-door version of the Wrangler. The 4Runner is still a body-on-frame style off-road vehicle. It has a 109-inch wheelbase, so it's definitely in the same realm as the Wrangler. We have overall off-road ability and overall ground clearance figures that are similar to some Wrangler models, but the 4Runner is not quite as extreme overall. And there's some things that we don't find available in the 4Runner, like there's no available factory front locking differential at the moment. It's also worth noting that Toyota has not updated the 4Runner significantly in quite some time, and the 4Runner ends up falling behind the Wrangler in terms of overall fuel efficiency, engine modernity, and of course the overall interior style, interior trappings as well. But on the flip side, the 4Runner has proven to be incredibly reliable, and it's also going to be notably less expensive, because a TRD Pro 4Runner, for instance, tops out at around $46,815. That is significantly less expensive than something like a top-end Rubicon that's been fully loaded. But when you come right down to it, the 4Runner is still not the same thing as even a 4-door Wrangler, because the 4Runner was not designed to drive down the road without its doors, without the rear hatch, without the windshield, without the roof attached, etc. It's just not the same sort of beast that we see in the Jeep Wrangler. And I really applaud FCA for being able to try and still give us those features in a modern Wrangler, along with modern safety features. Some folks out there thought that they just wouldn't be able to do it, that there would not be able to be another Wrangler with modern fuel economy standards and modern safety feature standards as well. But FCA has managed to prove them wrong. They've given us a modern vehicle with a aluminum-intensive design, relatively decent efficiency as far as these sorts of vehicles go, but a vehicle that could still have a removable windshield and removable doors and a soft top or a hard top or a power top, depending on what exactly you're after. So bottom line, the Wrangler is kind of an odd duck here in America, and strangely enough, the most directly cross-shop vehicle is not a Tacoma, it's not a 4Runner. According to independent research, it is most frequently a rear-wheel drive convertible, something like a Mustang, something like a Camaro convertible. If you're surprised by that, maybe you shouldn't be, because remember, the Wrangler is frequently bought as a second or third vehicle. It's the fun weekend alternative vehicle, the vehicle that can take you to an adventure on the weekend. And for some folks, that's a very similar profile to a sporty rear-wheel drive convertible. Now, obviously, you're not going to take the Camaro or the Mustang rock crawling, so there is some variation there in what folks are planning on doing with their vehicle exactly, but you can see that it's a very similar thought process. Do I want the fun weekend beach vehicle, or do I want the fun weekend camping vehicle? Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below, and especially let me know what you might be cross-shopping a Jeep Wrangler with if you're shopping for one at the moment. You can also check us out at facebook.com/AlexNautos to see what we're driving this week, and I'll see you later.